newsagents.
So when do you expect planes to go?
Well, we've been clear we want planes to go as soon as possible.
But when do you expect them to go?
Well, we've got to sort this out first. I'm not going to put a date on planes departing.
Well, the Prime Minister said by the spring. Are you still sticking to that?
We will act as quickly as we possibly can. You know, if it was up to me, I'd be sending planes now. But we have to
break the law?
No, but as I say, we have to address the concerns of the Supreme Court, and that's what we're doing with this treaty.
Because your deputy chairman, as you know, said, "Let's break the law."
Well. I'm not saying that, and the Prime Minister is not saying that.
He doesn't speak for you when he says that.
I am not saying that. What I'm saying is that we are going to address the concerns of the Supreme Court, and I believe that we can do that through this new treaty.
That's Gareth Davis, Treasury Minister, speaking to Kay Burley on Sky News this morning. Wasn't quite saying, a la Suella, it was his dream to see planes taking off for Rwanda, but it's absolutely clear that is what the government wants, even though getting it done is looking increasingly fraught.
And difficult for Rishi Sunak, who is being buffeted on all sides by his parliamentary party, even by his cabinet. Do they go for a treaty? Do they go for it anyway? Are they willing to break or to change or to duck out of international law, even common law, to get the Rwanda plan done? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily. And previously, as they say, on the Newsagents, we brought you the Rwanda plan slapped down by the Supreme Court. That was last Wednesday. A big blow to Rishi Sunak and his government and his plans for how to tackle the small boats asylum crisis as he sees it. And within 24 hours, maybe even 8 hours, he had come up with Plan B, which was this idea of a treaty, that you would just go back to Rwanda and say, don't worry, we've codified these things into a treaty, and now Rwanda will not be breaking human rights laws, and it will not be able to send people back to their country of origin. We've got this one nailed down. But a row is now brewing within the party between those who want to support the Rwanda plan, but only within the confines, if you like, the guardrails of international and our own common law, and those who are going, should we call it the Lee Anderson way, and just want to rip the whole thing up or knock down whatever's in front of them and just get the planes in the air, whatever it takes, a sort of sod the lot of them.
And within that, there are also kind of little variations, because it wouldn't be the Conservative Party unless you had a whole different range of views. Because the other thing that Rishi Sunak wants to do is to pass primary legislation through the Commons and through the Lords, which declares Rwanda a safe country. Now, even though the Supreme Court has said, no, it's not a safe country, we're going to pass legislation which just says, yes, it is. And therefore the courts can no longer say Rwanda isn't a safe country. And that is the whole black is white, white is black policy that seems to get in favour with Rishi Sunak. But it was interesting, there was reporting in the Times this morning about the number of people round the cabinet table who are saying, whoa. And the way it's being framed is the full cream solution, which is Suella Braverman's approach, which is sod the lot of you. You know, you take a machine gun to everything just so you can get these planes to take off. There is the semi-skimmed version, which I think is where Rishi Sunak is at the moment. And then there are those in the Conservative Party and within the cabinet who want it skimmed, who want the bare minimum done because they think that is the best way and the best chance of getting it done whilst retaining Britain's international reputation and obligations that it has signed up to.
Yeah, because the point is, and I think we should make this clear from the start, that if you start finding your way around international law, eventually, or not eventually, pretty quickly, your partners in things like the Windsor Framework or the Horizon deal or any returns, a deal that we're trying to have with Europe, with France, with Brussels, starts to evaporate because they just look at us and say, well, they don't really respect anything that is written down. So why would we assume that this deal stands up or this framework will hold water? And I was talking to somebody in the party who I would say is not a centrist, very much on the right of the party. And they said, look, there was a real spring in the party's step last week when Suella went. You know, she cooked her goose. She doesn't have the temperament to be Home Secretary. We definitely don't want to see her back as the leader of the party. But, and this is where it all comes back to, if it's not Rwanda, what is it or where is it? There is a sense that something has to change, that Western Europe cannot take the numbers and it can't assimilate the people in the same way that maybe we did in a post-World War, Second World War phase, and that actually these treaties are 70 years old and maybe it is time to see tweaks and adjustments and all the rest of it. So I think there is probably a space here for Rishi Sunak to say, not we're going to break the ECHR, not that we're going to go against our own common law, which, be under no illusion, we would actually have to break domestic law to get some of this stuff through as well. But to say, even with the best will in the world, something that's 70 years old probably should be modified or changed or looked at again. Whether they can do all that before the next election, whether they can do all that to get the planes off the ground by the spring, as promised by Rishi Sunak, is very doubtful. But I think there is that sort of room there of something that includes Rwanda or something that sounds like Rwanda but isn't. And yet, what we're now hearing is the moderates, the centrists of the party coming through, and we haven't really heard from them in this debate before.
Well, I think what's really interesting is that there is a perfectly credible intellectual argument which says that the conventions that were brought in after the Second World War about asylum are utterly irrelevant today, and that you need to have a new framework that recognises the nature of patterns of migration from Africa, from all other places around the world. It was seen then as a European problem and dealing with it after the upheavals and the shock of the Second World War, and that it's not fit for purpose today. But you're not going to get that in the next 2 or 3 months whilst you're trying to sort out the Rwanda crisis. Therefore, what is the correct approach? I also had some interesting conversations over the weekend with someone in the House of Lords, a Conservative in the House of Lords, who was saying, look, this stuff is not going to be easy to get through. You've got a lot of crossbenchers, you've got the Lords temporal, you've got the Labour benches, the Liberal Democrats, who, if they sense that there is going to be this kind of power grab by Downing Street just so that they can get these planes off the ground, there is going to be fierce resistance within the House of Lords and from some on the Conservative benches as well. And that they have to be cognizant of this when they're framing what is the legislative approach. But you're absolutely right, I think, to point out that we have heard so much over the past, let's say, 3-4 years.
6, 7, 8?
6, 7, 8 years, maybe 20 plus years, maybe going back to John Major 30 plus years ago, from the right of the Conservative Party trying to push the party in a certain direction, pulling it on Europe, pulling it on other things, now pulling it over immigration. And that what's happened is that the soggy centre, if you like, has stayed rather quiet, hasn't been out there fighting. I think that is the most significant change over recent days and weeks as a result of Suella pushing so hard from the other direction.
Yeah, I mean, that's the key question. Is it because, in that phrase, she cooked a goose? She just went too far and everyone is now sort of thinking, blimey, we've got to pull the pendulum back. Or is it that she's now gone? And there is that sense that, whether or not you think of David Cameron as a centrist or, the architect of austerity, there is a sense that he is probably an institutionalist, right? And that there are voices now who we haven't heard from much in the last few months, maybe few years, certainly not much under Boris Johnson, not much at all under Liz Truss in that brief period, and not very much under Rishi Sunak, who is suddenly starting to go, look, if we're really heading towards the electoral wipeout that some commentators, some pollsters are predicting, what have we got to lose? We should be speaking up now and seeing if we can't actually claw the party back to a place where it feels respectable and not, in the reputed words of James Cleverly, batshit, right?
You said something really interesting when we have our editorial call in the morning to discuss.
I always say interesting things.
Oh, you always say
Every
interesting
morning.
things. But this particularly interested me, which was you'd heard someone pointing out that Suella Braverman had done an interview for the Mail on Sunday, her first interview since her spectacular fall, the vicious letter that she wrote to Rishi Sunak, and the interview was on page 16.
It wasn't a front page spread.
So how the mighty have fallen, that you go, I'm going to break my silence and give the Mail on Sunday an interview, and the Mail on Sunday think, page 16.
Yeah, so does that mean there is a calculation now that the right-wing press just want to support Rishi Sunak, whatever he's doing, and that those on the outside now are probably on the outside, so they don't count, until she, perhaps plots a comeback.
So what are the legalities? What are the choices that the government faces as it grapples with kind of trying to get Rwanda Mark II off the ground? Well, let's speak to Sir Robert Buckland, former Lord Chancellor, Conservative MP, very thoughtful on what the government needs to do next. I just wonder where you think the debate is now over what the correct approach is to get these planes taking off to Rwanda.
Well, I think the government have acknowledged that because of the Supreme Court judgment and its very clear finding on the evidence that they've got to devise a Rwanda Mark II. And that does have to be a different scheme in terms of the detail from Rwanda Mark I. And let's face it, it's not just about Rwanda. It's also about whether you can come to deals with other countries in order to help manage the influx of asylum seekers. So this is an important test for the government. And it's really incumbent on them now to get the detail right.
Has Suella Braverman's idea, her 4-point plan or 5-point plan, got it right?
No. I think that I'll be kind and say that I'm assuming that it was a sincere attempt to try and find a way through. But I think in doing so, it's focusing in part on the wrong issues.
And if you were being unkind, what would you say?
Well, I'd say that it was largely a red herring. I mean, withdrawal from international treaty obligations or the disapplication of them, it is, I think, first of all, really ill-advisable for this country's role in the world. But secondly, is not a task of moments. It's going to take some time in order to disentangle ourselves from these obligations. And time is something the government doesn't have. So it needs some very speedy solutions working together with Rwanda itself in order to come up with something that will hold water. Because even if we weren't in the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, John, there's domestic law here that would still govern how the courts would view any scheme. And therefore, the real thrust of the Supreme Court decision last week was that ECHR or no ECHR, that really isn't germane to the question.
Robert, you're a former Lord Chancellor. What would you say to the Immigration Minister, your colleague Robert Jenrick, who's pushing for emergency legislation to disapply the Human Rights Act and direct the courts to ignore the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights? What would be your message to him?
Well, I would say proceed with care. I myself, as a minister, have successfully brought in ouster clauses. That's clauses that oust the jurisdiction of the courts in immigration appeals. And in fact, only last week, the Court of Appeal upheld the very ouster clause that I brought in the Judicial Review Reform Act. So it can work, but it needs to be very, very carefully couched, very clear and based upon a rationale that is respectable and works. My worry about taking wholesale approaches to, remove and oust the jurisdiction of the court in this way is that inevitably it will not just lead to legal challenge, although you can't obviously, strike down primary legislation. It's going to lead to conflict between what the domestic law says and what our international treaty obligations are. And I think that's just a recipe for disaster, frankly, bearing in mind Britain's reputation and role in the world. And using those sort of nuclear options to deal with what is a very small part of the government's response to the small boats crisis is, I think, at best a diversion, and at worst it's massive overkill when it comes to how to deal with this issue.
And when you say recipe for disaster, what do you think the knock-on effects will be for our standing as a country?
I think people are going to start questioning, whether Britain is serious about its leadership and role in the world. The Council of Europe was something that we helped set up after the war. We've shown real moral and political and defence leadership on issues like Ukraine. And I think it's been really good for the reputation of this country that we've done that under the leadership of successive Conservative prime ministers. And at a time when the world is looking for countries that are stable, that believe in the rule of law, that are offer certainty, it's not just good for our standing internationally, it's good for investment and our economy too. And the Northern Ireland dimension to all of this is always ignored, or far too often ignored by some of my colleagues. Underpinning the Good Friday Belfast Agreement is an adherence to the European Convention on Human Rights. And I think unpicking that now at this sensitive time in the politics and life of Northern Ireland, again, endangers our union and undermines a very, very important achievement that led to peace in Northern Ireland.
So, Robert, what is your message to those on the right of your party who are clearly trying to pull Rishi Sunak in a certain direction?
Well, look, my message to them and to everybody in the party is to come up with practical solutions to this problem. I think for the government to advocate a new treaty with Rwanda seems sensible. It's what's in that treaty that's going to be important. And it seems to me that coming up with concrete ideas, and to be fair to Suella, she does come up with some ideas about how to better monitor the scheme in country. Building on that, as we did, for example, with the Abu Qatada case, where we got the Jordanians to reform their court system in order for us to safely deport him there, we should be looking at Rwanda to change its systems, and indeed, frankly, looking at the operation of the system itself, perhaps by making sure that we deal with all appeals here in the UK before sending people to Rwanda. So let's come up with some hard and fast practical solutions that deal with the objections of the Supreme Court.
Just confirm what you're saying there, Sir Robert. You're saying that they should look at the applications in the UK first and then send people to Rwanda.
That could be a way forward here, that the assessment process should be very much one that is controlled by the UK system. And therefore, rather than exposing people to the sort of risk that the Supreme Court identified, that we have far more of a purchase and control on the process itself. And that secondly, in Rwanda, they could pass domestic legislation in Rwanda that ring fences the safety of this scheme and underpins its integrity in a way that could pass muster with any court that's looking at it as a result of a challenge.
But that's Rwanda changing its own domestic law before we can sign any treaty with them. I mean, that's not going to happen in 42 days, is it?
It could be done. With a treaty obligation can be signed now, and then it could be, part of Rwanda's domestic legislation, I would have thought, in fairly quick order. I mean, I'm not going to speak for the Rwandan government. They've got their own processes and their own ways of doing things. But it does seem to me that sort of approach, using domestic laws in Rwanda, making sure that our own systems are actually dealing with the processing of applicants in country before we send them over there. We need to look again at the nuts and bolts of this system in order to iron out and eliminate the sort of problems that bedeviled Rwanda Mark 1.
So what you seem to be saying is, look, as an institutionalist, we've got to do this the right way. But against that, you've got the political imperative, the timetable, the sense of an election impending, and we've got to be seen to be doing something now. Which should win out? Getting it right or getting it done quickly?
Let's get it right, shall we? I think the British people actually do believe in due process and the rule of law, and what they don't like is being sold something that then doesn't work. We've got to be honest and frank with people to say that this is one of the most difficult problems facing us and other Western governments. The way that we get it right is, frankly, through what the Prime Minister has been doing with countries like Albania, and reminding everybody that Rwanda is a small part of a bigger approach that's being taken to already seeing reductions in the number of people coming here via small boats. Of course, our pledge is to stop the boats. That's been made very clear. But I think that it's important that in doing so, we don't sacrifice the very values and standards that our country has represented over the generations. When we go to war, we fight to preserve our freedoms, and we try and make sure that there's a balance between defending our way of life and not surrendering our freedoms because of national security issues. We've got to strike the same balance here in this crisis to deal with it robustly, fairly, but that is consistent with our domestic law and our international obligations, which aren't going to go away with a puff of smoke from a parliamentary procedure.
Just before we leave this completely, Sir Robert, can I ask you to step back? Because the first time I remember when we heard about the Rwanda plan from Boris Johnson, nearly 3 years ago, a lot of people in your party were horrified at the very idea. It seemed unethical, immoral, unconstitutional and unworkable. And now I'm not really hearing that from the Conservative Party. I'm just hearing we've got to make it work in the right way. Nobody seems shocked by the idea of sending people to Rwanda anymore. I mean, is that a fair assessment of how your party has shifted towards the idea now?
Well, no, Emily, to be fair, I think people like me were saying, long ago that this was really about whether or not the scheme would work and what impact it would have. The principle of using third countries is not unlawful. The courts themselves have said it's not unlawful. It's a principle that was being looked at by countries like Denmark long before the UK. And indeed, we've only heard in the last few weeks that other European countries are looking to come to similar arrangements with other third countries. So I don't believe that this is immoral. What I do believe is that it needs to be practical. And that's why I think looking at the detail and coming up with practical solutions has got to be the way forward. I don't agree with Keir Starmer when he says, even if the scheme works, I won't do it. I think that's at the other end of the extreme from those who are saying, let's abandon and walk all over our international law obligations. Labour really have to do better than that if they're going to help solve a problem that concerns many, many people in our country, and rightly so.
Really interesting to have your thoughts. Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
There is an imperative on this show to mention the Overton window once every sort of 4 or 5 months.
I swear most people have no idea.
It's basically how public opinion shifts. And the reason I'm raising it is because I remember what happened when Rwanda was first mooted as an idea. And it wasn't just kind of lefty liberals saying, it was many people within the Conservative ranks themselves who were going, bloody hell, what is Boris Johnson thinking now? And the idea of Rwanda was almost like the joke idea of the worst possible punishment for anyone who wanted to come here. I'm not saying that's necessarily fair on Rwanda. I'm saying that was almost the framing of it. And now, in the way that most of the party talk about it, they don't think of it, or they don't talk about it as something unethical or as something that suggests our values are warped. They just talk about it as if it's something that is difficult, unworkable or legally tricky.
Which I suppose is sort of the success of the right of the Conservative Party.
Right.
That they introduced this idea which brought gasps when it was first mooted as an idea of putting plane loads of people to Rwanda and get them over there, and kind of, if their asylum claim is successful, they live in Rwanda, and that we were just contracting out the process. And everyone was saying, well, you can't do that, you can't do that. And now, much more the debate is, well, how do you do that? I mean, and how can you make that work? And hearing that other countries that are not batshit crazy, like Germany, are also looking at...
They're looking at it, but I think it's worth noting that Israel tried it, and actually, as the Supreme Court said last week, it failed. And when you're hearing that Denmark's trying it, they haven't done it yet. So a lot of countries are now, maybe they're looking at the UK as a leader on this one, or maybe they're all coming up against their own forms of legal constraint, because it isn't actually as workable as it sounds when you're just sort of throwing these things out as the Prime Minister.
But what has happened with the Rwanda thing is that it is where politics has met the law,
right,
and lost. Cue the Clash.
Yeah.
I thought the law and the law won. Shall I do a singing rendition of it? No, I won't.
That's my job.
You're Joe Strummer.
I could do it in Descant.
Anyway. Now we're just getting weird. And what's happened is that politics is trying to fight back. We know where the right of the Conservative Party is. What's interesting, I think fascinating, is the extent to which kind of moderate opinion, like Robert Buckland, are trying to fight back. And Damien Green, who was the deputy chairman of the Conservative Party under Theresa May, is sort of leading the counter-revolution.
Yeah, trying to find this sort of muscular centrist position.
I would make and re-emphasise the point. It's not just pulling out of the ECHR though I feel that would be foolish for many reasons. It's pulling out of the Torture Convention, the Refugee Convention, and it's overriding our own domestic courts protections like judicial review and the common law. That what I've seen described in the press as the full fat solution seems to me to go against a lot of really basic conservative principles, and so I very much hope that the cabinet ends up with a semi-skimmed solution.
Do you really think that Rishi Sunak could go that far?
No, I don't. I mean, and I obviously, I hope he doesn't, and I don't think he will. Not least because he is capable of seeing things in the round. And if, just to take one example, we pulled out of the ECHR, then we know that breaks the Good Friday Agreement. It's a really serious thing that there's a whole part of that agreement which is about rights, safeguards, and equality of opportunity, and included in that is a pledge that the UK government would complete incorporation into Northern Ireland law of the ECHR with direct access to the courts and remedies for breach of the convention.
Just on these kind of measures, the full cream version of what Suella Braverman and her supporters want. They say the Conservative Party is going to be absolute toast at the next general election. It will face a wipeout unless it deals with this problem in a pretty punchy way, to use your term, to get this done.
Well, as I say, I'm as keen as anyone to see this problem solved. It is a big problem. It's an important pledge that the Prime Minister has made, and I can see why he wants to fulfil that. But we're just arguing, if you like, about the practicalities, and if we're descending to the politics of it, then it seems to me that the harder the solution, the wider the solution that the cabinet comes up with, the less likely it is to get through the House of Lords in time for the planes to take off. That actually, if you have a measured and proportionate piece of legislation that directly addresses what the Supreme Court says, you are much more likely to get that through both houses of Parliament in a timely way than a piece of legislation that starts trying to tear up large parts of the judicial system that we have in this country.
In a moment, we'll be talking AI. Well, we were sort of talking AI. We're going to be talking about what has happened at OpenAI and the demise of one of the titans of this kind of emerging world. And what on earth went on in bringing down a man who seemed to have all the answers to everything, and what was going on? If you know one name from AI, it is probably Sam Altman, who is in charge of OpenAI, but we really know OpenAI because of ChatGPT. And this weekend, he has been on a roller coaster ride. Fired on Friday for reasons that are at best opaque. On Sunday, there was an attempt by some investors and staff that he should be reinstated. And by last night, he was off to Microsoft. So we're going to try and figure out what on earth has happened, because it does seem like a major intrigue. Well, we're joined by Alex Krasadomski, who does digital tech and works at Chatham House, the great think tank. So, Alex, the really sophisticated question, what the hell just happened there?
I mean, it's the biggest question, though, isn't it? I mean, you had as you say, the best known figure in AI, someone who had been at the UK AI Summit, had been doing this world tour, talking about AI, really a darling of the technology world, who's just been binned, I suppose, and then just 4 days later has moved over to the company that has ultimately put 10 billion into the company that he's just left, and who sort of has a controlling stake in the sort of for-profit bit.
So why?
It's really difficult to know. I think there is all kinds of rumours swirling here, but I think one of the things that we should look for here is this idea that AI has sort of two directions. I think a lot of people working in AI are split between those who see it as the future of business and those who see it as sort of the future of humanity, like electricity or fire. This enormously powerful technology that we need some kind of maybe democratic oversight of, or maybe we're going too fast and developing too quickly. And I think what we're seeing here is a disagreement at the highest level between parts of OpenAI who felt that they needed to press on as fast as possible, and parts of OpenAI who perhaps, for whatever reason, felt that we were going too fast.
And what was Sam Altman? I mean, what was he doing that got him fired?
We don't No, I think there are a couple of sort of anecdotes that come up, but we also have to look at the backgrounds. Sam Altman is no doubt incredibly tech savvy, but he's a venture capitalist. The other people on this board, perhaps most prominently a scientist called Ilya Sutskever, he's sort of the brains behind a lot of this technology, and we are told has a much more cautious approach to thinking about AI, while perhaps Sam wanted to put the pedal down to the metal and really, really push ahead. That probably was music to the ears of Microsoft.
So does Sam Altman know enough outside the company to do whatever is he now the robot gone mad, if you like? Can he just take whatever he knows, whatever he's learned, and apply it to, in this case, Microsoft, the next big place?
It is very probable that a lot of the talent that OpenAI had been investing in, and actually the Microsoft had been investing in through its work with OpenAI, will now move and set something up within Microsoft, and importantly, outside of the board of directors that appear here to have been trying to sort of slow the progress and hit the brakes a little bit.
I mean, what's really interesting is that I guess this is a microcosm of the whole question of whether you can contain AI, right? Or, ChatGPT and how it's going to actually change us, because we're always talking about, whether it can be regulated, whether it can be something that you want to go faster or you have to slow it down. And I guess this is what happens in real life when it moves too quickly. You evade regulation by going elsewhere.
I think it's funny, isn't it? Because in some ways, bringing all of this capacity in-house might now draw the attention of regulators. Right. But I think critically, the question here for us is who's in control? Let's take these concerns sort of at face value. And as I say, we really don't know what happened behind closed doors here. But let's say that the board felt that Sam was moving too fast, that this was dangerous in some way, and that they had to slow down. That will not be the conversation, I don't think, that's happening at Microsoft in quite the same way.
Right. You characterised it in a certain way about the speed with which you put the accelerator on against going slowly. Is there another way of characterising it, which is AI is going to take over our lives, could imperil the Western civilization, but we can make a hell load of money in the meantime, or this is a real danger and so we need to slow down a bit?
A lot of very smart people are very worried about the prospects that AI has in terms of both near-term impacts affecting our working lives today, tomorrow, maybe even yesterday, actually, if we look at how technology has changed our lives over the last couple of decades. There are others who really want us to focus on the really existential risks, maybe in 10, 20 years' time, maybe even sooner than that. No one more so, actually, than our Prime Minister. The AI summit hosted in this country was very much focused on the risks of frontier AI, these most powerful artificial intelligences being built by companies like Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, and others. I think the person who comes out of this whole situation the best is probably Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, who many say has pulled off a masterstroke here in bringing all of this talent into Microsoft, and certainly the Microsoft share price points that the markets think this has been a very successful move, and at a time where it could have been enormously damaging. Microsoft invested 10 billion into OpenAI, and the future for that organization, I think, is now much less clear than it was on Thursday. I think there was a really interesting moment. So a week ago or so, OpenAI held something called its Developer Day, which sort of, like a lot of technology companies do, sort of highlighted the exciting things that were happening for the year ahead or whatever. OpenAI sort of spoke about this new way for companies to use ChatGPT to create amazing dedicated services. One of which, by the way, was Laundry Buddy, which is some astonishing piece of technology to help you do the laundry. Now, the contrast between that and OpenAI's sort of founding mission is to create what's called an artificial general intelligence, a hugely powerful artificial intelligence that might make humanity's lives easier, better, might change the world for good. You have that on one hand, you have Laundry Buddy on the other. And I think that was quite a watershed moment, I think, for perhaps people within OpenAI to think, are we on the right track here? Are we developing this with the right goals, with the right ambitions, with the right safeguards, or have we lost sight of that.
Or is it too late? I mean, is it too late to be asking the question, quite frankly?
And this
Because if they're not doing it, somebody else is, and there's money to be made.
Right, exactly. And this isn't the first time this has happened even to this company. Anthropic AI, which is another artificial intelligence company, initially broke from OpenAI over precisely that question: is the development we're doing too commercialized? Are we really sticking to the mission of making sure this technology does good for the world? If I had to guess, I'd say this has been a good day for the corporations looking to
Speed
things up and to make sure that this technology keeps them ahead of the game, and probably not such a good day for the so-called decelerationist, the people who want us to slow down a little bit and make sure we know what we're doing.
I mean, do you really think there is a kind of philanthropic side to AI? Do you think people really kind of envisage it as being the saviour of the world and the solver of problems, of sort of evil? Or do you think it's just very exciting? In the same way that genetics, it can be sort of hugely both, right? You can,
Or if you look at another tech example, Wikipedia, open access, Jimmy Wales, who founded it, he's not a billionaire, whereas the founders of Google most certainly are.
Yeah,
it's very difficult to sort of separate in any of the communications around AI what is kind of hype, what is marketing, and what are the sort of genuine beliefs. Obviously, it makes for quite good marketing material if you are developing the most powerful, dangerous technology in the world, right? Because only we can control this incredibly. But if you believe that this is the most powerful, potentially catastrophic technology in the world, wow, I mean, that's a pretty important, exciting, valuable thing to be stewarding, to be in charge of. I do believe that a number of people working at OpenAI, at Anthropic, at a number of these companies are genuinely want this technology to do some good in the world. It is difficult to do that in some corporate environments. I would assume it will be more difficult for people with those sort of ideologies, those ambitions, to do so under the structure that we sort of announced today.
So a step backwards, really. I mean, that's what you're saying.
Well, certainly a step backwards for OpenAI. I think a blow to those who would like AI to be developed in the open, to be developed for the public good, and not entirely dominated by a handful of technology companies like we've seen with social media or other sort of digital technologies in the past.
Really interesting.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Alex, thank you so much for coming in and explaining. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you saw Bernard Manning trending, that was because Javier Milei is being compared to the 1970s British comedian, stand-up comic Bernard Manning, because he has this wild sort of mop of hair and he kind of looks like he sort of takes the mic on stage and sort of leers drunkenly from one side to the next. But the point about Milei is not actually what he sounds like or what he looks like. It is what he's talking about. And the reason that the chainsaw may become symbolic is because he is talking about taking a motosierra, that chainsaw, to the state, to the economy. Argentina has seen inflation at 140%. And he is the guy who has just pipped a very sort of quiet, moderate, left-wing socialist, a Peronista, to win the presidency. And he has done so by saying, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Yeah, and he's going to say, right, we've got the peso at the moment, we're getting rid of that, we're going to take the dollar, we're just going to have the US dollar as our currency, so the central bank needn't do anything. We'll just have that instead. We're going to close down whole government ministries. We're also going to be socially conservative again. We're going to make abortion incredibly difficult. And he says there's no time for a gradualist approach.
Yeah.
This is going to be a revolution.
Chainsaws are not notably gradual, are they?
No, they're not consensual instruments.
If you don't softly with a chainsaw.
If you don't do this, I'm coming at you with a chainsaw. It's kind of unambiguous. Anyway, Maitlis, I've got to give you a quiz question.
Go on.
Who said, congratulations to Javier Milei on a great race for president of Argentina. The whole world was watching. I'm very proud of you. You will turn your country around and truly make Argentina great again.
There you go. So the MAGA crowd alive and well this time in Argentina. Other acknowledgements, not quite so warm, and it's an interesting pattern that is shaping up in the sort of the continent of South America right now, because you've got Lula da Silva in Brazil, who actually was the one who ousted his own populist, Bolsonaro. And Lula has kind of gone, oh, well done, but, keep your populism where you are in Argentina. We don't want to import that in Brazil. There was a time not so long ago when it looked like that continent was going to go through what they called a pink wave. More socialist leaders were coming in. And I always find the question, we often get asked this sort of, just more generally when we're kind of out and talking and having discussions with people, is the world getting more or less populist?
Yeah.
And I find it so interesting because you can point to Italy in Europe and say Meloni, populist, and you can point to Spain and go, oh, Vox failed. And so I think you end up sort of not being sure whether we are moving to or from populist in a kind of global way. But certainly in Argentina, back in with a bang.
Yeah, well, this conversation could go on and on, because I'm going to say that actually Meloni has turned out not to be a populist Italian prime minister and has turned out to be a very capable Italian prime minister in a kind of and governing in a way that is winning support from all sorts of quarters in surprising ways.
Maybe not domestically.
Yeah.
And I guess there's a difference between populism and sort of hard conservatism and abortion rights and all the rest of it.
But that's a whole nother podcast.
It's a whole nother podcast.
We've got to go now. We're probably at 35, 40 minutes
I just
already.
Remembered. This was our out. This was just an outro.
I know.
No. We were just literally going to give you the chainsaw and have a laugh.
Yeah. Well, anyway, the chainsaw is back in Argentina.
Yeah,
if
you've
you're
got all
planning
the
a
rest for
holiday
free.
there.
Yeah.
Beware of chainsaws.
Oh, I tell you what. He might have a little spot at his cabinet table for Liz Truss. She liked taking a chainsaw to the economy, didn't she?
We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.